Let's take a look at the future of Los Angeles, 27 years from now, in 2019. Perhaps it's the recent past. We're looking for someone, or something, more human than human. We're looking for the baddest Blade Runner of them all. Welcome to the WYCU, the Weyland-Yutani Cinematic Universe. It's past time to take a look at one of the most enduring science fiction franchises, or meta-franchise, and shared cinematic universe. Over the course of these 4 episodes of the Implausipod, we're watching all 19 movies in one series in the WYCU, but we're watching them with a twist. We're not watching them in release order, for we're watching them chronologically, as they appear in the timeline, in-universe, as they appear from historical times to the near and far future. This is part 2, where we look at the Blade Runner universe, as well as a few titles that are tangentially connected to both Blade Runner and the WYCU, and try and figure out how it all fits together in this episode of the Implausipod. Welcome to the Implausipod, a podcast about the intersection of art, technology, and popular culture. I'm your host, Dr. Implausible. So if we've been exploring the WYCU, the Weyland-Yutani Cinematic Universe, what are we doing over in the Blade Runner Extended Universe? How did we get here if Weyland-Yutani, a Hellcorp introduced in the first Alien movie in 1979 and an integral part of the series, and retconned as part of the Predator franchise in 1990's Predator 2, isn't even explicitly mentioned in the 2 official Blade Runner films? I think it goes without saying that beyond here be spoilers. Buckle in. Sometimes these points of connection are needle sharp, just a tiny little fishhook to hang a thread on, but a single thread is all we need. If we look at the original point of connection, the franchisal intersection between the Aliens and Predator continuity, it was simply the prop of an alien skull included in the set dressing of the spaceship in Predator 2, just something to fill out the background. But there was enough thread on that story hook to tie together 2 franchises and weave together multiple stories into a fascinating meta-franchise. And while the xenomorph skull serves as a quilting point there to the Predator franchise, we can now link another thread to the Alien universe, to Earth's distant past, back to 2019. Well, maybe not that far distance, but close enough to draw in the Blade Runner franchise, which includes both the original 1982 film, as well as 2017's Blade Runner 2049, and a few tangentially related films, let's say. Given all that, what exactly are we talking about here when it comes to the Blade Runner films, and where would it fit within the timeline of the WYCU? Let's see how they're all interlinked. Yes, interlinked. Interlinked. Blade Runner is perhaps best described as a neo-noir proto-cyberpunk film set in the Los Angeles of the distant future of 2019. That's a lot of adjectives to describe what is essentially a sci-fi detective story. Directed by Ridley Scott, off an adaptation of Philip K. Dick's 1968 novel Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, and a screenplay written by Hampton Fancher and David Peoples, the movie was originally released in 1982, and subsequently re-released multiple times after in slightly different versions, though we'll get to more on that later. Starring Harrison Ford, who was well on his way to becoming a household name after the first 2 Star Wars picks, as well as Rutger Hauer, Sean Young, Daryl Hannah and her brother Larry, and Edward James Olmos in his pre-Adama phase, Blade Runner is the story of a near-future Earth that has developed some artificial persons called replicants and uses them as slave labor in hazardous locations like off-world colonies. Several of them escape and make their way back to Earth, where they blend in and try and get more life. When a police detective is wounded while interviewing one, a retired officer named Deckard is brought back to track down the remaining replicants. So I guess we could say it's really a story about immigration. Current events, so to speak. I'll leave it to the listener's imagination what that makes Deckard. The replicants are bioengineered, but with a fatal flaw that they only have 4-year lifespans, so they set to work hunting down a means to extend this. We get dueling detectives, as both Deckard and the replicants are chasing different targets through the cyberpunk city of a future Los Angeles. The street-level adventure takes place in and around the vendors, merchants, shops, and patrons of the near future that just passed. Deckard follows the official channels and meets with the manufacturer of the replicants, the Tyrell Corporation, and ends up talking with the founder, Eldon Tyrell. This takes place sometime after he had been a mentor to Peter Weyland, but we'll have to talk about that in a later episode. Though it does look like there's a strong thread tied to that hook. Deckard tests a young woman named Rachel, who he finds it very difficult to determine is actually a replicant due to Tyrell implanting memories in her so that her reactions are more genuine. They meet a bit later after a nightclub visit and interview goes poorly. We also soon meet Roy Batty, the leader of the Nexus 6, who pursues his own investigation on the street and connects with another Nexus 6 named Pris, who has ingratiated herself with one of Tyrell's chief engineers, Sebastian, though he doesn't have his brothers Daryl and Daryl living with him, unless they're actually puppets. Batty gets Sebastian to take him to Tyrell, where he literally meets his maker, and is informed that unfortunately any attempt to extend his 4-year lifespan would result in catastrophic mutations and or painful death. Given this news, I think he takes it rather well. Deckard catches up to Batty back at Sebastian's recently vacated home apartment complex and attempts to complete his assignment. He's nearly slain by Pris, but turns the tables and then engages in a wall-smashing fight, ending on the rainy rooftop in one of the all-time great soliloquies in cinema. It is really a great one. I'd like to read the quote in full. Quote, "I've seen things you people wouldn't believe. Attack ships on fire off the shoulder of Orion. I watched C-beams glitter in the dark near the Tannhauser Gate. All those moments will be lost in time, like tears in rain. Time to die." End quote. I know I don't even do it justice, but that's just epic. Blade Runner is ultimately a story about humanity, about what it is that makes us human, about what we do with more life we have, and how it is finite and precious. What would happen if you come face to face with your maker and learn that you are the way you are due to decisions made by a company? Would you react any differently? There are questions we'd each have to ask ourselves. When it comes to Blade Runner the movie, a fun thing for me personally was that I quote-unquote saw the movie shortly after release, but didn't actually watch the movie until around 3 years later when I was in my teens. I picked up the single-issue Marvel Comics adaptation of the movie that was released around the same time, in 1982, if what is left of the search on the internet is still to be believed, and I read the heck out of that, just like any kid. Blade Runner is a seminal work in cyberpunk cinema, defines so much of the neo-noir feel that many of the works in the genre emulated, in much the same way that the movie Tron from the same year defines so much about cyberspace. We've talked about Tron recently in an episode, if you want to track that down. So, while it might not be an influential work in something like the Appendix W on Warhammer 40k, aside from the Tyrell arcology showing up in things like the hive planets of Necromunda, Blade Runner is most definitely an influence on Appendix C, or the Cyberpedia, or Cyberpunk Bookshelf, or whatever we end up calling it. Much like other works we've talked about, both in the WYCU and the Appendix W, there's a lot of ancillary tech in the Blade Runner universe. Throwaway shots and effects that have as much or more impact than the tech the movie is ostensibly about. In honor of how much there is here in this 2-hour movie, let's run through some of them. First off, the spinners, the iconic flying cars. Some days it feels like they're the most fanciful piece of tech in the flick, and then the next day you see a video of someone modifying a drone for single-person carrying capacity, and maybe you feel like they're right around the corner. Even the ground-based cars in Blade Runner had a near-future vibe, over-engineered and heavy, and, well, driving on the heavily trucked streets of a modern city, you wouldn't be shocked to see something right out of Blade Runner there, too. The digital image processor that Deckard uses to hunt for clues seems to be beyond us, but the hyper-scaled enhancement of modern photo software isn't that far off. The cyber eyes seem to be inching closer to reality too, but these are closer to genetically designed than constructed, the way we think about it. They have more in common with the bioengineered animals, and even those seem to be more likely, ever since Dolly was cloned, and with de-extinction programs like that of the group working on the woolly mammoth fitting right in. The Voight-Kampff test used by Deckard to test Rachel, basically an embodied Turing test made real, seems like we'll need one right around the corner as well, with AI detectors built into our desktops and phones at every moment. And the vast building of the Tyrell Corporation shows up later in cyberpunk fiction and gaming as an arcology, a massive self-contained building housing people, offices, factories, and often food production, retail, and entertainment. We don't have them here really, but there are some proposals, and we might see them in our near future. The giant video billboards adorning the sides of skyscrapers have finally become a reality thanks to cheap LEDs powering everything from Times Square, the Sphere in Las Vegas, and Shinkansen in Tokyo. Even the all-around hairdryer thing that Zora uses can be found online for purchase, though it hasn't become quite as institutionalized as we saw there. One of the things that may have contributed to the amount of ancillary tech that we see is that often it is actually just that, tech, devices, things, not just software on a screen, but the imaginative ways of thinking about our electronic interactions within a near-future material world. The other is that the movie has had one of the longest time frames for its influence to be felt and the tech to be developed. It's a lot easier for throwaway tech to show up in the real world if you have a 40-plus year development cycle. Returning to the film, as we alluded to earlier, there are several different versions of the Blade Runner movie in existence. The original theatrical cut, a director's cut released at the start of the home video era, and an ultimate cut which came out. The main difference is the removal of Deckard's narration, which is a studio-mandated addition before the movie was sent to theaters and put in there against Ridley Scott's wishes. There's also an added scene with Deckard and Rachel making their way to the countryside, again narrated by voiceover. The director's cut makes it more ambiguous that Deckard himself may be a replicant, but for me, I think the theatrical version was burned into my brain at a young age, and that it seems normal to me. But the director's cut is an enjoyable watch as well, and not at all hard to follow without the narration. Perhaps we as audiences have gotten a little bit more savvy to sci-fi themes and tropes in the decades since the release of the film. It might be hard to prove, but one of the things that the various reissues and adaptations did was keep the single-film franchise available and accessible for new audiences to find, whether it was from comic books like the one I read, or from the new cuts, or for it always being available early on in new media cycles, which may be apocryphal, of course, but I recall it being available on DVD earlier than a lot of the other 20-year-old titles. There's always been a version of Blade Runner available, and the audience interest has driven a growth in transmedia storytelling in much the same way that we've seen before, both within the WYCU as with the Predator titles and outside with Tron and other titles as well. Blade Runner made the leap quite well to video games, with a number of games set within the universe, tasking you with using your detective skills to solve them. Much of the WYCU is driven by those transmedia connections, which sometimes fill in the gaps between the films and sometimes expand the scopes of the stories being told. But beyond those transmedia connections, here's where it gets wild, with how the Blade Runner franchise connects to the larger WYCU. Blade Runner is the first in the Blade Runner franchise natch, and the 9th movie overall in the expanded continuity. Even though we covered Predator Badlands in the previous podcast episode, we're not quite sure where that one pops up. It is definitely after this. We've got a definite connection and interlink. Interlink. We jump forward from 2019 to 2035, where Chicago seems to be somehow cleaner and less rainy than LA, but still kind of a mess. After a top scientist takes the express exit from a high-story corner office, Detective Spooner is brought in to investigate the potential homicide by request from the deceased, despite it being ruled a suicide. Impressive. Like I said, top science. The investigation points towards one of the latest model robots as a suspect, despite them having been installed with the 3 laws of robotics at the factory. We'll put a pin in those laws for a second and get back to them. Spooner is a cyborg, built stronger, better, and faster after a near-fatal accidental run-in with a robot that led to the death of a young girl. So he's got some robo-beef and doesn't believe the marketing hype as a new line of robots is being rolled out across the country. This soon leads to an all-out war against the robots, as the central AI that connects to all of them is using the bots to take control of humanity and stop the self-destructive course they're on. I mean, the AI isn't necessarily wrong here, to be perfectly honest. Like the saying goes, every good villain should kind of have a point. Spooner and some others are able to fight through the AI-controlled robot hive mind to the central core and inject it with some nanite goop that was the rage back in the 1990s comic books, which immediately ends the control of all the robots, who are then decommissioned. It's here where our diegetic interlink appears, a Weyland-Yutani logo stenciled on a case. iRobot is a 2004 film starring Will Smith that is loosely, and I mean very loosely, based on the 1950 novel by Isaac Asimov. That is to say, it's Asimov-flavored in the same way that naturally flavored orange water may have passed within a few yards of an orange at some point. It's naturopathic Asimov is what I'm saying. Directed by Alex Proyas off a screenplay ostensibly by Jeff Vinter and Akiva Goldsman, the movie also stars Bridget Moynihan, Alan Tudyk, Chi McBride, and a returning nowhere man as the CEO of the corporation. We're including iRobot in the chronology because of that diegetic interlink that we just mentioned, though it's a singleton and we're not including it in the Bladerunner franchise. It's just slots in here during our chronological rewatch, sitting as the 10th movie overall in the WYCU. I'll admit I came to see iRobot late, as I didn't get a chance to watch it in the theaters and ended up seeing it on DVD. I was getting a better sense of movies based on the trailers, and this one didn't really appeal to me, despite the subject matter and my having read the Asimov novel when I was young and impressionable. Of course, one of the big takeaways from Asimov's writing was the 3 laws of robotics, a set of rules that were supposedly hardwired into the positronic brains of the robots. They are as follows. 1. A robot may not injure a human being or, through inaction, allow a human being to come to harm. 2. A robot must obey the orders given it by human beings, except where such orders would conflict with the first law. And 3. A robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second law. This gives us a framework for the robots to act in, and functions as a plot device for stories to be based off of within Asimov's works. The laws are also pretty sticky memes, and variations of them show up in stories by other sci-fi authors as well. The laws have been tweaked a bit, and a 0th law was added later, the basis of which allowed Vicky, the AI in the movie, to attempt to protect humanity from its own self-destructive tendencies. But we'll hold off on this for a bit and maybe talk about it when we visit the Foundation series sometime in 2026. Like a lot of the sci-fi of the early 2000s, one of the things the movie does have going for it is the amount of ancillary tech that we see, including badge scanners, funky printouts and display surfaces, and the automobiles. Often sci-fi vehicles look like something from a designer's prototype lab, which is funny because it's true, but here it isn't just Will Smith's sleek personal coupe, but also the massive, autonomously driven delivery vehicles with rolling slat sides that deliver the robots right to you like an oversized Necron troop carrier. Sorry, that last reference might be a bit obscure, but I'll let you, the listener, bing that up. Most notably, however, among the ancillary tech is U.S. Robotics itself. U.S. Robots and Mechanical Men was the company responsible for building the robots in the original novel by Asimov, in line with the Tyrrell Corp in Bladerunner or Weyland-Yutani themselves, but one that ended up becoming a real company, as the firm U.S. Robotics, the famous makers of early computer modems and networking hardware, was named as an homage to the original novel, and now operates under the name USR, as a division of a larger corporation. Overall, the hooks and threads here tying this into the WYCU are thin, and given how the whole larger Asimovian robots and Foundation universe connects together, perhaps we don't want to draw too tight of a connection, but what we're seeing here with the development of both cyborg humans and synthetic forms of life finds us with a degree of consilience and overlap with the other entries in not just the sequence here, but also the broader WYCU. However, there was more going on in 2035 than we expected. Interlink. Interlink. And I say there's more going on in 2035 because in 2036, the off-world colonies are getting a little bit restless, much like they were back in 2019, but we might be getting a bit ahead of ourselves. In 1996, a secret government military program begins training children to become ruthless soldiers. Not universal ones, mind you, but close enough. After countless battles on multiple planets, a new program of genetically engineered soldiers promises troops that are better, stronger, and faster than the ones that came before. After an internal contest, the old models are reduced to KP duty, and the defeated Kurt Russell, Todd 3465, is dumped on a trash planet. Yes, much like Star Wars, planets can only be one thing in this universe, too. Turns out there are survivors of a crashed colonist vessel there, and Todd slowly ends up getting accepted by the village. When the genetically engineered soldiers end up at the planet on a recon mission, their commander orders them to assault the planet or to gain some combat experience, and Todd goes full Rambo on them. With Rambo mode activated, this isn't a close contest, obviously, and the movie ends with Todd and the surviving colonists and other soldiers making their way to the colonists' original destination. I don't mean to gloss over the details of the movie or give it short shrift, but the phrase, "it's not that deep," serves us well here. It is mostly an action movie with little dialogue uttered by the protagonist. Soldiers starred Kurt Russell in the lead role and was released in 1998. Directed by Paul Anderson and written by David Webb Peoples. The cast also included Connie Nielsen, Jason Scott Lee, and Gary Busey, returning to the WYCU after his gonzo turn in Predator 2. Maybe it was a distant relative, though given the movie is set in 2036, not that distant from 1997 of Predator 2. Underneath the surface, Soldier asks us similar questions to Blade Runner, wondering what makes us human, with the older model soldiers potentially being replaced by the newer quote-unquote model that has been genetically engineered. This engineering isn't quite to the level of the replicants in Blade Runner, or at least not explicitly mentioned as such, but it could be. If we look at it askance, we can see that there might be some overlap. Soldier doesn't quite give us the level of detail on the genetic engineering going on for us to really make a determination one way or the other. But that's just one way to link it back to the WYCU. Soldier was described as existing within the Blade Runner universe by the writer David Webb Peoples, a sidequel or spin-off. And aside from the aforementioned spinner on the junk planet, we see that Kurt Russell fought in some of the same battles as Roy Batty, the Tannhauser Gate and such. So that, and the existence of the off-world colonies themselves, seem to be enough to connect them together, even if the new model army soldiers might not be necessarily replicants. This would also put it second within our micro-franchise and 11th within the larger WYCU. Given the time frame, it kind of does slot nicely in within the chronology, though we'll explore that a bit more in depth near the end of this episode. I don't think Soldier really influenced much in terms of Appendix W, though the ridiculously oversized guns and the APCs do seem to draw a direct line between the real world and what we eventually see there, as does the genetically engineered soldiers. Other than that, we're not seeing a lot of instances of ancillary tech either, other than some of the weapons tech, and it's almost kind of low tech in some instances, but it still fits within our timeline, where those genetically engineered life forms are getting more prevalent back on Earth. This is our last interlink. Interlink. Looks like a lot has happened in 30 years. We begin with some expository text, letting us know that replicants still exist, but the Tyrell Corporation is no more, having gone bankrupt after several rebellions. It has been succeeded by the Wallace Corporation, which has kept the Nexus product label for some reason. Maybe this is like Lenovo buying the ThinkPad rights off of IBM, but you think that after your quote-unquote product revolts a couple times, someone in corporate might have put together a pitch deck for a new name. So maybe not that much has changed after all. We're treated to a car flying over a desaturated landscape, past solar power collectors and blasted farmland, where hydroponics reigns supreme, like we're passing over the cucumber farms of Medicine Hat. I'll admit that might be a niche reference, so you can bing that up yourself. The car lands by a blasted and desiccated tree, and the pilot gets out to meet the farmer who's hands deep in his aquaculture business of algae and mealworms. Turns out he's an escaped replicant who's been hiding under the radar, and he is soon retired, but not without a wall-busting fight worthy of Roy Batty and Deckard from 30 years earlier. But there's more to the farm than expected. A LiDAR scan shows a chest that ends up containing human remains, humanoid at least, and this sets off our mystery for our detective, who we learn goes by Kay. Back at the police station, without the escort needed for Deckard, we find out that Kay is a replicant, so nothing left to ambiguity there. Kay is shunned by the other officers and also needs to keep taking quote-unquote baseline tests to make sure he's on the straight and narrow. I guess this is how they prevent the replicants from revolting? Unsure. Kay lives alone in a small apartment with a holo-girlfriend named Joy that he is clearly infatuated with. She's kind of like the virtual opposite of Robert Picardo's doctor, but more along the lines of Cyborg Betty. So we have a relationship between two post-human characters, a genetically engineered human and a virtual companion. It's wild stuff if you think about it, but maybe that's what it's all about, post-human relationships, because that's kind of what the first movie was about too, when you get right down to it. Kay visits the Wallace Corporation as part of his investigation, and we, the audience, meet with Wallace, the presumably trillionaire CEO and designer of the company making replicants, who has cyber eyes and a complete disregard for replicant life, and is just as alien and post-human as the replicants and holograms. Wallace also wants to find the secret for what was in the box, which contained the bones of Rachel from the first movie, who has apparently given birth, which means that replicants may be able to reproduce. For Wallace, this would mean a massive expansion of his ability to produce colonists in labor for the off-world colonies, as he wouldn't have to continue with the presumably slow process of creating full-grown replicants and could just let nature take its course. So, much like the first film, we get that duality, that mirror structure of the detective looking for something that others want to find for their own ends. This might be a trope that is endemic to detective fiction, to be honest, but I don't consume or analyze a lot of detective stories. It's worth looking into, though. Kay's pursuit leads him to the memory of a specific date, 6/10/21, which would have been about 2 years after the first film, long enough time for the birth of a child if it was Rachel's. This leads him further on the hunt for the mystery, through an orphanage and his own memories, where he thinks that he might be the actual child. A memory crafter, trapped in an isolation bubble, lets him know the memory is real, though real for who is the question. He finds Deckard in the radiated wasteland of Las Vegas, which doesn't look that different now that the tourists have stopped going. However, they're both ambushed by Wallace's pursuit team, who kidnaps Deckard and takes him back to L.A. Wallace offers Deckard a recreated Rachel in exchange for the information, looking as she did 30 years ago, except the dev team botches her eye color and Deckard refuses. As he is escorted out, Kay manages to force the spinner he's been transported into the ocean, and a fistfight with the other replicant ensues. Narrowly winning, Kay takes Deckard to meet his and Rachel's daughter, the memory crafter in the bubble, and then lays down on the steps in the snow in L.A. Directed by Denis Villeneuve and released in 2017, Blade Runner 2049 moves the timeline ahead by 30 years, natch. The screenplay was written by Hampton Fancher and Michael Green, and stars Ryan Gosling, as well as Ana de Armas, Jared Leto, and Harrison Ford and Edward James Olmos in a post-Adama appearance. 2049 is the 12th film in the WYCU chronology and the third film in the Blade Runner meta-franchise, though by the time of its release there were so many transmedia releases, tie-in novels, shorts, and other pieces of content that it's hard to really pin down a number. Like a lot of Denis Villeneuve movies, I had to watch this at home as I run the risk of passing out halfway through the movie. It is visually stunning, though, and deserves to be seen on the big screen. Much like the first movie, there are a number of interesting ancillary tech pieces that feel like might be decent candidates to see some real-world invention, like the personal home holograph companion, along with subscription plan and upgrade packages, natch, as well as the holographic costume overlay and the memory sculpting as an Etsy artist. But for a lot of the tech, the movie feels too recent to say for sure. While Blade Runner 2049 has strong ties to the original Blade Runner film, it doesn't really connect out from there to the larger WYCU. That doesn't mean it isn't there, as the more advanced models of Replicant have more in common with the later synths that appear in Alien Earth and the Aliens franchise, though we'll get to those connections when we come across them. Ultimately, there are two questions we have to ask about these films in the franchise. One, does it fit with the technology? And two, does it work within the chronology? I think the answer is yes to both, but with a big asterisk in both cases as well. Tech-wise, the films work. There's an interesting overlap between the diversity of approaches to transhumanism within the films, whether it is through life extension, artificial life, cybernetics, genetic modification, or psychological training. We see all of these throughout the films, and I believe we'll see more of these forms of life in the later films as well, so we'll stay tuned for how they connect in the next episode of the WYCU when we look at Alien Earth. The more challenging connection is the timeline. Obviously, Blade Runner now exists in our past, with 2019 in the rearview mirror, and the 2035 and 2036 of iRobot and Soldier coming up surprisingly quickly. And while humanoid robots are starting to feel like they are just around the corner, off-world colonies are more than a little way off, despite what some techno-optimists might have you believe. I think the solution here might just be to move the entire mini-franchise, or a section of the WYC year, ahead 30 years, though granted, iRobot could stay where it is. This would put Blade Runner, the original Blade Runner, at 2049 instead of 2019, like the original movie, with Soldier taking place in 2066 and Blade Runner 2049 in 2079. This also keeps this entire chain ahead of all the Alien films, because the earliest Alien film, Prometheus, is about 2093 in terms of the chronology. So let's just give it a 30-year time jump, and that'll get us to the third challenge introduced by the films, with the off-world colonies of Blade Runner and Soldier particularly. These are also meant to imply extrasolar, not just planets within the solar system, but outside of it. While the Predator films obviously had extraterrestrials capable of interstellar travel visiting Earth on a surprisingly frequent basis, human-driven off-world travel doesn't appear to be in the cards based on our current understanding of physics. It's the one big lie behind most science fiction stories that if you can get past that or find a way to handwave it to your satisfaction, well, then you have a whole galaxy to explore. But who knows what horrors lurk in interstellar space? We'll step away from the WYCU to visit the Fallout universe prior to the release of the second season, with perhaps a few other holiday stops along the way, but then we'll be back to pick up the final two parts of the WYCU early in 2026 with a look at Alien Earth and the Aliens franchise. I hope you'll join us for those. Once again, thank you for joining us on the Implausipod. I'm your host, Dr. Implausible. You can reach me at drimplausible at implausipod.com, and you can also find the show archives and transcripts of all our previous shows at implausipod.com as well. I'm responsible for all elements of the show, including research, writing, mixing, mastering, and music, and the show is licensed under a Creative Commons 4.0 share-alike license. You may have also noted that there was no advertising during the program, and there's no cost associated with the show. But it does grow from word of mouth of the community, so if you enjoy the show, please share it with a friend or two and pass it along. There's also a Buy Me a Coffee link on each show at implausipod.com, which will go to any hosting costs associated with the show. Until next time, take care and have fun.